This week we are covering a very special and very important topic, and it's also going to be a bit unusual because you're actually receiving two parts to this lesson this week. We are diving into the balance of masculine and feminine energy within. Now, there are so many people telling us today that we should simply dwell in either our masculinity or our femininity, that women should be purely dwelling in their feminine energy to be able to usher in an incredible partner and a wonderful life. Similarly, we hear men frequently being instructed today to dwell or live fully in their masculine energy, and that by living in their masculine, they will be able to command rooms, they will be able to build empires, and they will succeed. And often, these same teachings then tell us that to find a partner, we must find someone complementary. So a man dwelling fully in his masculine should look for a woman fully in her feminine. Today's teaching is going to be a bit controversial because I'm going to debunk all of that. But first, why should you even care? What is the entire issue? Why is it such a buzzword today to discuss masculine and feminine energy and inner balance within? When an individual has shut off either their masculine or feminine energy within, and remember, all people are meant to have a healthy balance of both, although it's not always necessarily a 50-50 even split. You'll learn more about that in part 2 of this class. For now, know that it is perfectly natural to have a different level, unique balance of masculine and feminine in a person. That's completely fine and natural. But when we have shut off masculinity or femininity within ourselves, and this is for a man or a woman, when we shut that off in ourselves, the consequences can be extreme. It affects our relationships, both platonic and romantic. It can affect the jobs that we're drawn towards and how successful we are in our work. It clouds over and can even completely block our ability to see what our true purpose and path is in life. It affects how we parent our children, and it can actually lead to generational imbalance throughout a long lineage in a family. You may even be able to look today at your family members and see some of that imbalance taking place throughout your own lineage. And if we don't begin correcting that, if we don't begin addressing that inside of ourselves, then we perpetuate it. We allow that generational curse to continue on through the family. And that's not something that we want to pass along to children. But the 3 biggest issues that I tend to see with people who have cut off or limited, quieted their inner masculine or feminine, is they struggle to communicate with people, both of their gender and the opposite gender. They really, really struggle to communicate. The second, they find themselves habitually attracting and magnetizing to themselves romantic partners and friends who they themselves are severely imbalanced as well, leading to very explosive dynamics in that friendship or that relationship. And the third is, I think, arguably the most important. When we cut off masculine or feminine energy within, it begins breeding within us self-hatred and self-judgment. We feel something is inherently wrong inside, that we're not whole, that there's something that needs to be fixed inside, but we can't even quite put our finger on what it is. We just know that it feels like we don't know everything we're supposed to know to be able to succeed in life. It's that feeling of thinking somehow something is inherently wrong with yourself that can lead to a vicious cycle of beating yourself up, judging yourself, and even self-sabotaging, not realizing that there is a path forward and you're not stuck living like that forever. And I'm living proof of that. I spent years hating myself, judging myself. I picked apart every insecurity, every perceived flaw, internal and external, and it was miserable. And it was through training with my dad and learning the art of inner balance, of appreciating and understanding both the masculine and the feminine, both in ourselves as well as in other people, that it actually changed my life. And that's not something that I say lightly. I don't mean to use a cliche, but it quite literally transformed every aspect of my life. Romantic relationships, friendships, even work. When I began living with more balance, I found promotions coming with ease. Closing sales, negotiating contracts happened with ease. And it was mind-blowing to see how things improved. Even my health improved in my body. So I want to share some of that with you today. You may be wondering, okay, great. What do I do? How do I solve this? What does this look like to be balanced? How do I have masculine and feminine without swinging too far to one side or the other? How do I maintain being attractive and a viable partner out in the world? How do I come across as strong but not controlling or bossy? How do I behave soft and nurturing without being weak or fearful? We are going to be diving into all of that today. And the first step is understanding how we even got here. It becomes very difficult to address inner imbalances or emotional issues or dysfunction without identifying how we got here. Because if we don't understand where we veered off our path, then we can be course corrected by someone aiding us, but what's to say we won't take a couple steps forward in life and go right back off the path again, finding ourselves again, beating ourselves up, self-sabotaging, running into failed relationships, money issues, you name it. And when I say how we got here, that's important because I'm not singling you out. When we look out at the country, I'm based in the United States, but also the world at large, we see that the vast majority of people, at least in my opinion, are living with some level of masculine-feminine imbalance inside themselves. And it's leading to huge issues societally. In some cases, we even see wars being started over this. We see financial catastrophes. We see environmental issues. And we're seeing global issues for both men and women at large. There are some brilliant researchers who have been speaking out publicly lately, talking about how we're really truly facing a cultural revolution in the world today as it relates to both men and women. And I tend to agree. We are seeing huge changes, and not all of them for the better. Huge changes and burdens being placed on the shoulders of men and women, and both are asked to largely suffer in silence. But we can only talk about an issue so many times before we need to act. We need to do something to address this. Why are so many men around the world today genuinely suffering? They are hurting. And why aren't we doing more to prioritize their care and their nurturing? Why are so many millions of women genuinely in pain internally? They are suffering. They feel alone and misunderstood. They feel mistreated. They feel abandoned and betrayed in many ways. I have people come to me in my private practice constantly complaining about this. And the interesting thing is, almost across the board, they tell me there's no one in their life who cares. There's very, very few people who they could even talk to about this. So we see the world suffering in just mind-blowing numbers. And I hope that this reaches whoever needs to hear it. And I hope this can help at least nudge you forward on the path of finding more harmony, balance inside yourself, and understanding yourself on a deeper level. Moving beyond any of this self-sabotage, this doubt, or any kind of destructive behaviors that you find yourself stuck in right now. So how did we get here? How do we have this mass imbalance happening all around the world? And how do we have so many people completely misunderstood? Why are we demeaning men and their role in the world And equally, why are we demeaning women and their role in the world, and how that impacts how we view masculine and feminine energy inside of ourselves? So to answer that, a very, very brief history lesson. And this one might surprise you. For thousands of years, cultures all over the world revered good women. We saw these women as wise. They were poised, sophisticated, but very importantly, they were loving. They were nurturing. They often knew about ancient sacred healing techniques, and they were trusted and revered in their communities and their tribes. We saw women serving in leadership positions. They were trusted advisors. They were known as being incredibly intuitive and experts at raising strong, healthy, vibrant members of the community. They were entrusted with raising the next generation, and they did a superb, superb job. Now we can look at all these different eras throughout history. Let's take the Victorian era, for example. And in the Victorian era, we saw people begin to revere, and they felt so much devotion to feminine beauty and the feminine ideal. There was such emphasis placed on poise, on manners, on sophistication, on beauty and appearance. And it was widely viewed that beauty was a mark of the sacred, of the divine. It was considered this profound gift. We held up these very poised, graceful, loving women on pedestals. And you can look through the ages, and we had these ever-shifting views on women, on femininity in the world. But you know, there was something that seemed to hold true through almost all of them. And that was a very specific type of woman. This was a woman who held great power and authority in the world or in her community. This was a woman with intelligence, with kindness. She had learned how to maintain a softness and loving energy within herself, but she upheld firm boundaries. Everyone knew not to cross her. These women were held on pedestals all over the world, and we see them in cultures all over the world. And do you know what we often called them? There was a nickname, and there's different variations on this, but one of the nicknames was the Kingmaker. These women were revered because it was said that if a man, a good, strong man, married a woman like this, he was almost destined to become a king, a ruler, a world changer in some way. And people often attributed it to his wife. They said this powerful, poised woman with powerful intuition, with these incredible gifts, she advised her husband, and they were a true partnership together. And we can look through the ages and we see that even up into, say, the 1950s and 60s, people still revered these women. We can look at the first ladies in the United States. We can look at the wives of leaders and moguls and executives all over the world. And they were often married to incredibly impressive women who upheld this standard of dignity, of morality, of being able to be firm but still tender at the same time, which is an art. And then things changed rather suddenly. And can you guess what it was? It was an invention that suddenly began shifting the view of women in the world. And I'll give you a hint. It happened in the 1960s in the United States. It was the advent of birth control. Surprisingly, this had a powerful impact on the public's perception of women and what women's gifts and role were in society. Previously, women had to be very selective about their partners because whoever they had a child with, they then were largely financially and physically dependent on that man for their safety, food on the table, their overall well-being. With the invention of birth control, much of that changed rather quickly. Suddenly, women didn't feel the need to maintain harmony in the household. In the past, and I'm not advocating for this to be clear, but in the past, before this happened, if a woman, say, behaved like a tyrant in the household, she was manipulative, controlling, or just difficult to be around, It wasn't out of the norm for the man to simply kick her out of the house and go find a new wife and start over. And that left the woman who was removed from the home could leave her penniless, without food, perhaps with children under her arms, and she was destitute. And women took note of this. They saw this happening all over the world, and it was terrifying. Many women felt very controlled and very isolated and suffocated in unhappy marriages, but they couldn't leave because at that time, there just really weren't financial opportunities available for women, certainly nothing like there are today. When birth control came out, again, that went out the window. Now women didn't feel the need to be as careful about how they interacted with men. They didn't feel so reliant on men, and this was largely pushed and promoted by the media. We were taught that it's okay. Now that can just be fun. It doesn't have to be as serious. But the world took note. We started seeing movies and TV shows, books, magazines begin to promote women more for their physical appeal and not a whole lot else. It was your looks were suddenly king, rather than, of the past, those powerful kingmaker women. Those women who were revered and respected for their actual inner gifts and traits, their spiritual gifts, their true character. That changed so suddenly when now it was really more about how attractive you were. How did you look in a swimsuit or a miniskirt? And we see that still perpetuated today. We see that continuously replayed in all forms of the media. That women's value is now largely about appearance, which could not be further from the truth of what women are actually meant to contribute to the world. And it certainly has nothing to do with feminine energy. Now we'll pause there quickly, because now we're going to turn briefly over to the men. And there's something very different but very interesting that happened to our men, this time in the 1980s. And it's still happening today, and it's actually happening today on an even larger scale, affecting men all over the world. Do you know what that is? Yep, I'm talking sitcoms. In the 1980s, we suddenly saw a massive pivot in how men were portrayed in TV shows and then in sitcoms, which became very popular in the 1990s and the early 2000s. In the 1950s through the 1970s, men were almost always portrayed as wise, strong, loyal, trustworthy, calm under pressure, and as these powerful, wonderful, benevolent leaders of their family and their community. And then in the 80s, that stopped. Suddenly, men were portrayed as stupid, as simply unintelligent, as confused, dependent on their wife to make all their decisions, as untrustworthy, even amoral and disloyal to their families, their wives. We saw men portrayed regularly as making classic stupid mistakes and, people in the family, even the children, talking down to their father, telling him that he was stupid and that the mother should control all decision-making in the family, that she was the only one who was intelligent. Now, of course, that's not actually accurate. We know that men and women are both capable of very high levels of intelligence, and that men and women have very different and very important gifts to bring to society, but to their families as well. We can look out at the world today and see that there are millions of incredible men, genuinely good, intelligent, trustworthy, gifted men in all walks of life, in every career path, in every nationality, every religion, you name it. We have wonderful, incredible men in our world, and yet we don't often see that portrayed in our TV shows, magazines, radio stations, music, you name it. And you may think, what's the harm? The sitcoms, the movies, they're just for laughs. It's just to burn off steam after a long day at work. But I want to remind you of the famous quote that we often become like the 5 people who we spend the most time with. And that is so true. Who we surround ourselves with has a huge influence on ourselves. It influences our levels of self-esteem, the careers that we choose, the vacations, the hobbies. Every pursuit, every aspect of life can be influenced by who we surround ourselves with. But I think often in society, we forget to take into account the entity that we spend even more time with than any of our friends or family members. That's often the media. Whether it's on your phone, your laptop, your TV, we are constantly bombarded with information. We live in this age of information, which can be wonderful, and we're very, very fortunate to live in the time that we do. But we also have to be conscientious about what information we're taking in and how it may be influencing us, just like those 5 friends. If we are surrounded by TV shows and movies that are depicting men as unintelligent, bumbling, untrustworthy, it naturally begins seeping into our consciousness, whether you are a man or a woman. And it begins affecting how we view men in the world, even men who don't deserve that view. And it begins affecting our view of masculine energy as a whole. So we see these 2 big changes taking place. We reduced women's value from these powerful kingmakers, these beautiful, intelligent, morally strong, and internally gifted women. And we reduce them to some chick that looks good in a miniskirt. And then 2, we saw that men were reduced from these strong, empathetic, powerful, intelligent beings who provided for and protected their entire family and often their entire community. And we reduce them to these bumbling buffoons. And neither of these are accurate. But largely because of this, it's not the only reason, but largely because of this, we are seeing men and women all over the world today terribly confused about what their own value is, about what their role in society is, about what it is they're supposed to do in this world, and also inwardly conflicted about romance, about marriage and dating, about raising a family, because they've seen and they've been influenced so heavily for so long with negative images about the opposite gender that it can implant very limiting beliefs in us that we then project out on our future partners, leading to very painful situations in relationships and often breakups. And if we had to sum all of that up, we could say that we as a society witnessed the sacred roles and the divine gifts of both men and women largely stripped from society and replaced with these very hollow models of what it means to be a man and a woman in our world today.